1, fight!
The never-ending battle between the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis continues on the Big Retro Show.
Get over here!
This time I'll be discussing home arcade ports. And no, I'm not going to be talking about home ports that appear on both consoles. And I also won't be including games that were fundamentally different from their arcade namesake. I'm looking at you, Shadow Dancer. I'm only going to be talking about games that did their best to bring the arcade experience to the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. So let's go. We kick things off with a game that I used to love playing in the arcades, and that is Midnight Resistance, the spiritual successor to another of my favorite arcade games, Heavy Barrel. The alien bad guys have taken your family hostage, and it's your job to get them back. You accomplish this goal with a whole lot of carnage. The game puts you in the role of one of two heroes who must rescue their family from the evil alien named King Crimson. The game is essentially a side-scrolling run-and-gun that borrows its control and power-up system from Heavy Barrel. In the arcade, you must play with a joystick that allows you to aim your weapon by rotating the stick 360 degrees clockwise and counterclockwise. It's a bit wonky, but it seems to work in the arcades. On the Sega Genesis, however, you don't have that signature joystick and must make do with using 3 buttons. One button shoots, the other locks your position, and another button jumps. The controls took me a while to get used to, but once I did, I began beating the levels more easily. The enemies you will encounter in this game are for the most part generic soldiers and artillery. As you progress in the game, the bosses you will need to destroy will become more alien-like. You acquire new weapons in this game by collecting keys. The more keys you collect, the better your weapon selection will be when you finish the stage and move on to the armory. Certain weapons require a set amount of keys, and let me tell ya, they aren't cheap. Some of the weapons, like this 3-way shot, are a joy to use, while others, like this shotgun, not so much. At any rate, this is a great port of the original arcade, given that the control scheme is vastly different. The game's graphics, and especially the music and sounds, are some of the best you will find on the Sega Genesis. This is a great port of the original arcade game. But wait, you couldn't play this awesome arcade shoot-'em-up if you didn't have a Super Nintendo. Aero Fighters is a great game that I would often see at the arcades and would always drop a quarter in. The SNES port of the game is faithful to the arcade version, albeit there are some limitations. In Aero Fighters, you fly as one of 4 international pilots who must take out the bad guys. I always used to choose this ninja-looking dude named Hien, simply because he looks so badass. The game is a basic shoot-'em-up that mixes fast-paced gameplay with a generous dose of rockin' music and 4 different storylines. Part of the game's charm is the different fighters you can play as. Each have their own unique weapon and bomb attack. The graphics on the SNES version are not as polished as its arcade namesake, but they are passable if you just want to get your Aero Fighters kick. The game has 7 stages, and its enemies and bosses coincide with its arcade big brother. The SNES port is just as fun. The one gripe that I had with this game, though, is the slowdown, especially when you have tons of enemies coming at you. I've seen this slowdown in other SNES games, and I have to give it to the Super Nintendo's lack of blast processing, or something like that. In all, Aero Fighters is a great home port of the arcade game, and is one that any fan of shmups and the SNES will want to try out. And sticking with the shoot-'em-up arcade games, I think it's a good time to talk about Truckson. Man, oh man, is this a challenging one. The game is a port of the arcade game that I actually never seen in the wild, and only really heard about it when it launched on the Sega Genesis. As you can tell from the game footage, Truckson is an overhead shmup set in space. Your mission is to take out these alien dudes known as the Giddens. Again, we are talking about an arcade game, so story really doesn't matter. What matters most is that you need to stay alive long enough to take them out. Easier said than done. Luckily, you can power up your ship to almost godlike tier by collecting power-ups dropped by your enemies. The weapons in this game are cool and all, but you really only need one. The lightning gun at full power gives you a sense of invincibility that often made me take for granted how the enemies maneuver, and take me out they did. Each of the game stages was broken up by boss fights, which get increasingly difficult with every stage you beat. One of the coolest things about this game is the bombs. When you use one of the super bombs, it gives you this death face. It's cool and a bit different from the normal ball of fire, or whatever, that most shooters give you. This game is designed to take your quarters, so you will be dying a lot. The game has limited continues, so it will be a bit frustrating, but don't let that discourage you from playing this fine arcade port. This is probably one of the best shooters on the good old Sega Genesis and does a great job of porting over the gameplay graphics, music, and sounds of the arcade cabinet. Let's talk about Captain Commando. Captain Commando is a beat-em-up that I'm not sure anyone wanted. I mean, who is Captain Commando? He's rather generic, and the arcade beat-em-up is a bit generic as well. The fans of the game got a home port of Captain Commando only on the Super Nintendo, and it plays really faithfully to its arcade namesake with a few drawbacks. In Captain Commando, you play as one of 4 heroes who must take out a force of super criminals who are being controlled by this alien dude named Scumicide. Just go with it. You don't need any fancy weaponry or even nukes to take them out though. All you need is some good old-fashioned fists of fury to beat them into oblivion. The game spans 9 levels full of henchmen. The moveset in this game is nothing we haven't seen before in beat-em-ups. You can attack with the press of a button and perform combos. You can also do dash attacks, jumping dash attacks, grapple attacks, and you guessed it, a move that drains your life but is a bit more powerful than the other attacks. For the most part, you'll be whooping on boys and girls, Neanderthals, ninjas, alien dudes, and other baddies. The characters you play as in this game had me scratching my head in the arcade, and still so in the Super Nintendo version. They all seem so out of place. There's this baby that rides this robot, you got Captain Commando, Mac the Knife, and this ninja dude named Ginsu. It's a bit weird, but you will quickly develop your favorite fighter as I did. The game's enemies, bosses, and levels are on par with its arcade namesake, so it does get points for that. But it gets points taken away for excluding some weaponry and the ability to jump into robots to do battle. The Super Nintendo version is also graphically inferior and has less enemies and cool stuff to look at as well. But hey, what do you want? It is an arcade port. In all, this game is pretty faithful to the arcade game, but it's just too bad that the arcade game is a mediocre beat-em-up. Captain Commando is cool and all, but have you heard of a game called Mercs? It's the arcade sequel to the much-loved Commando arcade game, and it made a splash when it landed on the almighty Sega Genesis back in 1991. The plot to this game changes depending on what mode you play. If you play the arcade mode, which is the one-for-one port of the arcade game, you must rescue the president from the bad guys. If you play the original mode, your mission is to destroy nuclear missiles so that the bad guys can't use them. More on the modes in a bit. At its core, Mercs is an overhead run-and-gun that lets you shoot in 8 directions. This game was so great in the arcades as it let you team up with 2 friends to take on the game's 7 stages. The controls of Merc were simple. One button shoots and the other lets you use a powerful bomb attack. Throughout the stages, you pick up different weapons by destroying crates, and the weapons fall in line with the typical run-and-gun fare such as flamethrowers, spread guns, and rocket launchers. One great aspect of the game is the ability to commandeer different vehicles. It adds great fun to the game and something that most run-and-guns fail to do. The bosses in this game are pretty challenging but are fun to fight nonetheless. Overall, the game is difficult because enemies come at you from all different directions. The game has limited continues adding to its difficulty, and I thought it would have been cool, at least in arcade mode, for the game to have let you continue a lot more. One big difference you will notice right away is that this is a single player game. In the arcades you can play with 3 players, but not in the Genesis version, which is a bummer. It would have been cool to have been able to play with at least one other person, as this game is really challenging. The game's arcade mode is a piece of cake compared to its original mode. In the original mode, the game's levels are redesigned. You start out by playing as one of the Mercs and must make it to the end of the level to take out a boss. Along the way, you will pick up medals that you can use to buy power-ups. This mode does not allow you to continue. Instead, it lets other Mercs join your team and you can switch them out once you find them on the fly. In this mode, each of the Mercs has their own different weapon, and there's really no way to switch weapons without switching dudes. I really like this mode as it offers something new and different from the arcade, but couldn't they just let us continue a few times? Anyhow, Mercs is an awesome port of the arcade game of the same name, and one that owners of the Sega Genesis can be proud of, since, it didn't make it onto the Super Nintendo. Killer Instinct. Back in the day, I would watch people play this game at the local college I went to, and it was a bit intimidating for me. And I often wondered if I could ever be as good as the dudes playing in the arcades. It wasn't until KI was ported over to the Super Nintendo that I actually tried it. And in no time at all, I was pulling off ultra combos with ease. This port of its arcade big brother is everything that the arcade is, albeit with less graphical power and downgraded sound. But that didn't matter to me. It's still a great port of the arcade game. The fighters are all here, and more importantly, the SNES pulls off the 3D look, albeit in a more scaled down way. This game is best enjoyed by practicing the moves and nailing the combos down, and as you can see from the footage, I was super rusty. I did manage to pull off some combos though. but nowhere near the amount of combos that I used to pull off when I was younger. Alas, I have no time to practice, and it shows. Killer Instinct is an arcade port of the SNES that I have to say is superb and should be enjoyed by everyone that loves the arcade game, and everyone that loves the SNES. When Strider landed on the Sega Genesis, we all thought it was going to be like the NES port that dropped earlier, but boy were we wrong about that. This game is probably the best port of an arcade game on the console, and it was a major coup for the Sega Genesis. For those who have never played Strider, it was a game in which you take on the role of this cyber ninja named Strider Hiryu. He is essentially on a mission to take down the Soviet government in a dystopian, futuristic Russia. Back in the day, this was one of the arcades that always seemed to draw a crowd, so it was a no-brainer for the Sega Genesis to port it over. Now, just to back up a little bit, the arcade got a port on the NES, but it was nothing like the original arcade game. It was more of a Metroidvania featuring Strider, so when I heard Strider was coming to the Sega Genesis, I was highly skeptical. As it turns out, I had no reason to be, because this is a perfect arcade port. You get everything here, from the levels to the graphics to all the epic bosses. Strider is a game that really defines what the Sega Genesis is all about, that arcade experience. Well, I finally did it. I caved in, and like all other retro gaming YouTubers, I talked about Turtles in Time. But you know what? I'm okay with that, because this is probably the best beat 'em up on the Super Nintendo, and you guys know that I love my beat 'em ups. Sure, this game got a version on the Sega Genesis, but I don't think I'm breaking my rule here because the Sega Genesis Hyperstone Heist was not an arcade port, but rather a reimagining of this game, which makes it fundamentally different in my opinion. At any rate, this game is every bit as great as its arcade big brother. By now you guys know the story. Shredder and Krang are up to no good and basically steal the Statue of Liberty, and it's up to you and your dudes to get it back. To do so, you need to make it like Bill and Ted and travel back in time. It's all so crazy, but you are playing as a mutated turtle who just happens to be a ninja. One of the best things about this game is its Mode 7 graphics. It was really mind-blowing at the time. This game differs from the first Turtle arcade game in that you can now slam your enemies like ragdolls. Your ninja skills have improved in time. Get it? By now you know that each turtle fights with different weapons, and my go-to turtle is Donatello. Gotta love that reach. I think my second go-to turtle would probably be Michelangelo, simply because I like his laid-back attitude. The combat in this game is super satisfying no matter who you choose, and best of all, the enemies and bosses are fun to fight. Sure, this version isn't as polished as its arcade big brother, but what 16-bit game is? Turtles in Time is a totally tubular port of the arcade game, and is worthy of being included in this episode. So now we answer the question of which 16-bit console did a better job of delivering that arcade experience. And I think you know where I'm going to go with this. It has to be the Sega Genesis. Nothing beats the Sega Genesis when it comes to arcade home ports. And I think that you might agree with me, but maybe you won't. It just depends on what kind of fanboy you are. Anyways, take out some more arcade ports of the Sega Genesis that make this system the best home console arcade experience you will find. And that's going to be it for the Big Retro Show. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Let me know if the Super Nintendo does a better job, in your opinion, of delivering that arcade experience. Or let me know if I was right by choosing the Sega Genesis. Until the next one, I will see you on the Big Retro Show.